our previous talks, we examined the life of Jews in the diaspora and primarily the dilemmas that they encountered within the Jewish community, as well as vis-a-vis the surrounding environment, their neighbors, and the government. I think, however, that one aspect was conspicuously missing in our discussion. Did Jews in the diaspora have any doubts about the legitimacy of their life abroad? Were there calls from Judea to the Jews of the diaspora saying, what are you doing there? You can easily come back, return to Zion. And today we're going to examine this question and try to understand how Jews in the diaspora understood their local establishment and maybe encountered some very, very difficult questions about their remaining abroad and not returning to Zion. And I'd like to begin with a quote from the second book of Maccabees. Now, as opposed to the third book that doesn't really deal with the Maccabean uprising, the second book of Maccabees focuses on the heroic deeds of Judah Maccabee and his brothers. And the book itself was written by a Jew living in the diaspora. His name was Jason of Cyrene. But apparently the book made its way to Jerusalem, and there somebody added to the book 2 letters written to the Jews abroad. And the text of those letters are very interesting. So let's look at the first and opening letter in 2 Maccabees, chapter 1, beginning with verse 1. The letter begins, the Jews in Jerusalem and those in the land of Judea, to their Jewish kindred in Egypt, greetings and true peace. May God do good by you. May he remember his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, his faithful servants. May he give you all a heart to worship him and to do his will with a strong heart and a willing spirit. May he open your heart to his law, the Torah, and his commandments. And may he may he hear your prayers and be reconciled to you. And may he not forsake you in time of evil. We are now praying for you here. Now, this is very interesting. So the Jews of Jerusalem are praying for their brethren abroad in Egypt. There's no reference here, even a hint of a reference. Isn't it about time that you returned to Zion? Now let's continue here with that letter. Now they get to the reason for writing the letter. Hanukkah is approaching. But of course, this was the first Hanukkah established only with the restoration of the temple, the purification of the temple. And so the letter continues, since on the 25th day of Kislev, which of course is Hanukkah, we will celebrate the purification of the temple, we thought it necessary to notify you in order that you also may celebrate the festival of booths. Now this is interesting. Apparently that year, Sukkot, the festival of booths, tabernacles, was not kept, possibly because the war was still going on. And so now, in Kislev, they're going to add the festival of booths to their, what we would call Hanukkah celebration, and also a festival of fire, because this too was established in the Second Temple period, and the book continues and describes how when the Israelites were exiled to Babylonia, the priests and others hid the sacred fire in Jerusalem so that it could be restored when the temple is restored or when a new temple is rebuilt. And Nehemiah almost magically, or his confederates, discover that fire or water that turns into fire, and so there's another festival of fire. Nevertheless, the Jews of Jerusalem informed their brethren, we are about to celebrate the festival of Hanukkah, 25th of Kislev, and additional festivals. And they continue. Since, therefore, we are about to celebrate purification, we write to you. Will you therefore please keep the days? That's interesting. Are they suspicious that Jews of the diaspora will not join them in celebrating the restoration of the temple? It's not clear. But because the author stresses, it is God who has saved all his people and has returned the inheritance to all, meaning the temple in Jerusalem and the kingship and the priesthood. The kingship, of course, there's no monarchy yet, But this is probably a reference to Mamlechet Kohanim, right? A kingdom of priests and the priesthood, as he promised through the law. And indeed, the law here is the Torah, so that in Exodus 19:6, God promises to establish a kingdom of priests. We have hope in God that he will soon have mercy on us and will gather us from everywhere. So finally a reference to an ingathering. He will gather us from everywhere under heaven into his holy place, for he has rescued us from great evils and has purified the place. Now, if we look at this letter, something's lacking here. For sure, please join us, the Jerusalemites write to their brethren abroad, join us in celebrating Hanukkah. What's missing is the expected bottom line. You know, we've restored Jewish rule to the temple and to Jerusalem. Isn't it about time that you joined us? The stress here is God will rescue us. God will gather us. Is there no requirement of Jews themselves to take that initial step and return? And this is lacking. Now, here I have to make a broader statement. In fact, throughout the Second Temple period, we have yet to encounter an explicit call emanating from the center in Israel, in Jerusalem, to Jews abroad anywhere, saying, you know, it's about time that Jews return to Zion. Now here, this letter was written in relation to the very early stages of the Hasmonean period, but it was probably written, or at least the book itself was presented to Jews abroad when the Hasmonean state already existed. In other words, this is striking, that an independent Jewish state was established in the wake of Judah Maccabees' successes. And we would expect that now calls for aliya, right, for a return to Zion, calls make sense. In other words, there's nothing to prevent you from coming back. And if we remember the end of the third book of Maccabees that we discussed last week, Jews were ultimately restored to a rather powerful position and had a good relationship at the end with the local government, with the local monarchy, the Ptolemaic monarchy. And so there was nothing really to prevent them from coming back. And yet, as I say, this is striking, and one almost wonders, were calls for aliyah simply unanswered? And we have no memory of them in our sources. But there's something even more striking, and that is whereas the Hasmonean state could not issue or did not issue calls for aliyah, the one person that seems to encourage at least individual Jews, if not segments of the Jewish population, to move from abroad to Jerusalem is none other than the ultimate king of Judea, Herod the Great. Herod the Great, of course, did not ever really receive positive references or what we would call some sort of image within Jewish literature. And yet it was under Herod that we encounter a number of different types of Jews moving from the diaspora back to Israel. Now, Herod apparently encouraged this movement. He had to fill up the depleted ranks of the Jerusalem aristocracy. Remember, Herod decimated the earlier aristocracy, the Hasmonean aristocracy. He, in fact, killed off a number of many important members of the Hasmonean family. And so he had to fill the ranks with a new priesthood. And rather than use the remnants of the local Jerusalem priesthood, he went abroad. And he encourages priests from both Babylonia, but primarily from Ptolemaic and then actually Roman Egypt, to come and move back to Jerusalem and assume the role of high priest. And so it is Herod that encourages priests to come to Jerusalem. He also encouraged, apparently, some Jews from Babylonia to return or to come to the land of Israel. We hear that he invites a group of Jewish soldiers to establish some sort of a military camp or actually a state in northern Israel, in the area of the Golan. We even know the name of the founder of that town, a fellow by the name of Zamaris, and the name of the town is Batira. So a different type of call or an invitation to come to the land issued by Herod. In fact, it was under Herod that probably the greatest Pharisee, the greatest proto-rabbi of the Second Temple period, Hillel the Babylonian, also makes his initial appearance in the land of Israel. I'll allow myself a personal anecdote. Many years ago, I gave a talk to a group that came to me through the Jewish Agency, and I told them, when everything is considered, I think that the earliest aliya activist that we know about in Jewish history was Herod the Great. What can I tell you? The audience was offended, right? That I had the nerve to compare that evil and cruel despot, Herod, with these aliya officials. And I realized they were offended. I had made a terrible faux pas, and I had to correct it. And I said, this was unfair on my behalf, on my part. I shouldn't have compared Herod to you because there was an obvious difference. And they agreed. And then the scoundrel in me couldn't be kept in. And I said, yes, there were obviously differences because apparently Herod succeeded in bringing some Jews to the land of Israel. That was the end of my invitation, obviously. But this is striking, that throughout the Second Temple period, there is no mention, no call for aliyah. That, we know of other Jews that moved to the land of Israel. For instance, Queen Helene, the famous convert to Judaism towards the latter part of the Second Temple period, from Adiabini, together with members of her family, moved to to Israel, and then make it to Jerusalem as well, and even are buried in Jerusalem. But again, this is not the result of a call to return to Zion, but rather this positive need to connect with Israel that was felt, interestingly, by converts. But if you look at the sources, nowhere do we find throughout the Second Temple period any serious call to Zion. And I think that the reason can be found in the passage we'll read from Josephus and another passage that we will read from Philo. Both of them really represent elements of Hellenistic Jewry, and Hellenistic Jewry seems to have been comfortable with a diasporic setting. Let's see what Josephus has to say. This is in his book Against Apion. Now, Apion was considered by Josephus to be the head of the camp of anti-Jewish intellectuals in Alexandria, and he gathered all sorts of calumny against Jews in a book that Josephus refers to as Against Apion. And here he relates to Apion's astonishment at the idea of Jews being called Alexandrians. And by this astonishment, Apion betrays stupidity. So here we have reference to Jews who want to be called Alexandrians, but the local Alexandrian establishment can't accept this. And Josephus explains why they should. All persons invited to join a colony, of course Alexandria was a colony established by the Macedonians way back, however different their nationality, take the name of the founders. So if you become a member of the colony of Alexandria, obviously you become an Alexandrian. It is needless to go outside our race for instances. Our Jewish residents in Antioch are called Antiochenes, having been granted rights of citizenship by its founder, the Syrian Empire, with the capital of Antioch, Seleucus. But now Josephus makes the important statement. It was not lack of inhabitants to people this city, that is to say Alexandria, whose foundation he, Alexander, had so much at heart. In other words, Alexander did not lack proper inhabitants to establish a population for Alexandria. This is not what led Alexander to assemble in a colony of meaning Alexandria, a colony of our nation. This privilege, settling in Alexandria, He conferred on our people after thorough and careful scrutiny. In other words, Alexander the Great wanted Jews to live in Alexandria as a reward of valor and fidelity. This is very, very reminiscent of the apologetics that we read last week in the third book of Maccabees, that we were invited to come here. We are the loyal citizens of Alexandria. We are loyal subjects to the monarchy. And he continues, Josephus, Alexander's opinion of the Jews of Alexandria was shared by Ptolemy, the original king of Ptolemaic Egypt, son of Lagos. He, Ptolemy, entrusted the fortresses of Egypt to their keeping. We saw this last week in 3 Maccabees, that the Jews actually serve as some sort of military support for the kingdom itself. He entrusted the fortresses of Egypt to their keeping, confident of their loyalty. Again, that word loyalty. Jews are loyal to the government and their bravery as guards. And when he was anxious to strengthen his hold upon Cyrene, in other words, further west in northern Africa and other cities of Libya, he sent out a party of Jews to settle there. In other words, Jews are deemed by the local establishment or by the local Hellenistic government to be the most loyal of citizens, or of residents at least, or of subjects, and can be trusted. If Jews actually believe this, then one can understand that there's no pressure on them, at least from within, to move to the land of Israel. They feel at home, they feel recognized, and the sense of being at home is repeated by Philo as well. Philo, again, living in the first century of the Common Era, lived through a very difficult time in Alexandria. In the year 38 of the Common Era, there was something very close to a pogrom enacted by the Greeks of Alexandria against their Jewish co-residents or co-subjects. And the Roman governor of Alexandria, of Egypt, Flaccus, according to Philo, really did nothing to prevent this pogrom. And Philo writes a book documenting Flaccus's ill behavior in dealing with the issue. And then Philo goes on to explain why the Jews had every right to be where they were. For so populous are the Jews that no one country can hold them. We saw that phrase already in an earlier session that we had. And therefore they, the Jews, settle in very many of the most prosperous countries, in Europe and Asia, both in the islands, on the mainland. And now comes the critical statement. While they hold the holy city where stands the sacred temple of the Most High God to be their mother city, yes, Jerusalem is their metropolis, their mother city, and there stands the sacred temple. But at the very same time, yet those, in other words, those lands and those cities which are theirs by inheritance from their fathers, grandfathers, and ancestors even farther back. In other words, there are lands that they have inherited outside of Jerusalem and outside of Israel from their forefathers generations ago. These lands are in each case accounted by them to be their fatherland, in which they were born and reared. In other words, Alexandria in Egypt is deemed by some Jews to be the fatherland equivalent to the city of Jerusalem. Once this feeling of belonging was established and enhanced, it's very easy to understand why Jews would not get up and just leave and go back to Zion, as it were, even if such calls were issued from Jerusalem. And as I said, for the Second Temple period, we have absolutely no such calls, no such addressing of Jews of the diaspora and suggesting to them, is it not time that you come back to Zion? And in each case, these lands are considered to be their fatherland in which they were born and reared, while to some of them they have come at the time of their foundation. Now, this is important as well. In other words, Jews belong because they helped to found the colony. They came as immigrants to the satisfaction of the founders. In other words, Alexander the Great or the Ptolemies encouraged Jews to be here, so they have every right to remain in Alexandria or wherever in Egypt, wherever Jews might reside at any given time. When you read a statement like this by Philo, it's quite obvious Jews are not going to get up and simply leave, even though there is a belief, and we saw that in 2 Maccabees, right? And we actually saw a hint of that, if you remember, at the end of the book of Tobit and at the end of the book of 3 Maccabees, although with 3 Maccabees it's not that clear. Nevertheless, yes, they'll constantly repeat that ultimate belief. There will be an ingathering. God will bring about the ingathering. And when you stress that God will bring about an ingathering, you're almost suggesting, and so you can wait until God so decides to do this. In other words, it does not impose upon itself upon the Jews themselves to make aliya. And so we're in a atmosphere where Jews of both of the Hellenistic Roman world and apparently of the East as well, of Babylonia, felt quite comfortable in the lands where they reside. Yes, as we saw in Alexandria, there might be a potential persecution. We saw that last week. There might even be a pogrom, as I mentioned today, under the rule of Flaccus. And nevertheless, Jews do not get up and leave, even though there was no physical force that prevented them from leaving. When we approach the post-temple period, things begin to change. But not at once. And this is also interesting. The generations from the destruction of the temple in the year 70, the destruction of Jerusalem, and until the Bar Kokhba uprising, 132 to 135, also do not evince any attempt to get up, leave the land of Judea, and leave the lands of their residence, meaning either Babylonia or Egypt, and move to Judea. I'd make another point, a somewhat uncomfortable point. Whereas Jews in the land of Israel, as they embark on 2 major revolutions, the revolution of 66-70 that brought about the destruction, and the Bar Kokhba uprising, as they embark on those 2 uprisings, they might have expected some aid from their brethren in the diaspora. Whether it's military aid, whether it's aid of one sort or another, or even political pressure, they might have expected this, and yet it was not forthcoming. And this is striking. There is a sense in the aftermath of the War of 70, a sense of maybe unity among different Jewish communities for one reason, because all of these communities, at least in the Roman Empire, were now required to pay a tax, even though some of them never participated in the war against the Romans. So that might have created a certain sense of unity. But when we go to the War of 70, the uprising of the destruction, and the Bar Kokhba uprising, I think it's striking that the diaspora seems to have remained quiet. There was one uprising in between during the years 115 to 116, 17, the war of the uprising of the diaspora, that suggests that there is unrest among Jews in the diaspora, but certainly does not evince a massive return to Zion as part of the underlying reason for that uprising. It seems to be more the result of very, very difficult relations between Jews and their either Greek neighbors or Jews and the Roman government, or both together, rather than a Zionistic type of an uprising that ultimately seeks to have Jews return to Israel. But then we come to the post-Bar Kokhba period. And now a major shift takes place. And this is striking as well. Nowhere in the first 3 generations after the destruction, among the great rabbis of the time, Yochanan ben Zakkai, his disciples, rabbis Joshua and Eliezer, and even Rabbi Akiva, arguably the greatest of all the early rabbis of the Mishnah period, none of them issue a call to Zion. None of them issue some sort of prohibition or a delegitimization of life abroad in the diaspora. And one would have thought that ultimately later redactors of rabbinic literature would have at least placed in the mouth of these great rabbis statements stressing that one must always live in the land of Israel. It doesn't happen. And apparently it is only after the Bar Kokhba uprising that we encounter for the first time, in other words, the generation of the disciples of Rabbi Akiva, primarily Rabbi Shimon, but not only Rabbi Shimon, and it is only then in the second half of the 2nd century that we encounter statements at first stressing the requirement to live in the land of Israel, but ultimately giving us the other side of the same coin, that it is totally illegitimate to remain in the diaspora, and that one who lives abroad evinces a lack of faith in God. Here we have from the Tosefta, and I stress these are sources of the Tannaitic period, meaning the early rabbinic period. These are not late statements dating to the 4th, 5th, or 6th century. These go back already to the 2nd century, maybe early 3rd. A person should always live in the land of Israel, even in a town in which the majority of residents are Gentiles and not abroad, even in a town in which all the residents are Israelites. Now, there might be a hint here in this statement to the results of the Bar Kokhba uprising, because as you know, the Jewish population suffered a tremendous blow during the Bar Kokhba uprising. And some sources give us hundreds of thousands, but even if it's tens of thousands of Jews that were destroyed, there was a demographic shift. And cities that had originally been Jewish, primarily Jewish, suddenly became mixed cities. Places like Lydda, and certainly cities that were never fully Jewish to begin with, like Caesarea, suddenly encountered an influx of non-Jews into those cities. So here we are told that you should remain in the land of Israel, even in a town in which the majority of residents are, I would add the word, are now Gentiles, and not abroad. This teaches that living in the land of Israel is weighed against, meaning is equal to all the commandments of the Torah. Of course, one could ask a simple question. Here we are told that living in the land of Israel is weighed against all the commandments of the Torah. Elsewhere in rabbinic literature, we find that the law of tefillin is equal to all the commandments of the Torah, or Shabbat is equal to all the commandments. I'm no great mathematician, but I realize that there's a logical problem here. If the land outweighs everything else, how can Shabbat outweigh everything else? One of the great scholars of the period suggests that this is a phrase used by the rabbis to stress a particular mitzvah is now being threatened. And when a mitzvah is being threatened, one stresses that today, at this particular moment in time, this law, this commandment should be considered the equal of all the other commandments because it is being threatened. And clearly, the land of Israel encounters a threat of sorts. As you may remember, even the name of the province was now shifted, was changed in the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba War from Judea, which still preserved the link between Jews and the land. It is now to be called Palestina, Syria, Palestina, Syria, Palestine. So severing the link, the demographic link in people's minds between Jews and the land of Israel. And now we read practical results of this stress on and this requirement to remain in the land. A person should not go abroad unless wheat sells at the price of 2 se'ah. Se'ah is a measure for the denomination for a coin of a selah. In other words, you may not go abroad unless there's inflation, unless prices have gone haywire. Rabbi Shimon said, under what circumstances may you leave? Only in a case when he cannot find any to buy. At any price. In other words, no. You can only leave the land when there is simply no food available. But if he finds some to buy, even if one se'ah sells for a selah, in other words, outrageous prices, he may not go abroad. And the example that they bring is from the Book of Ruth. For thus would Rabbi Shimon, again, the disciple of Akiva, teach. Elimelech, remember the beginning of the Book of Ruth, was one of the great men of his generation and a leader of the community. And because he went abroad, he died there with his sons in famine, while all of Israel survived in their land. As it is written, when Ruth and Naomi come to the city of Bethlehem, when they came to Bethlehem, all the city was stirred because of them. This teaches that all of the town survived, but he, Elimelech, and his sons died in famine. So here we now have the practical conclusion. It's not only that you may not leave the land, but even in dire circumstances, you may not leave the land. You must remain loyal to the land of Israel. And then we read, this is a much later story, which I thought kind of stresses probably the need of rabbis such as Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai to convince his disciples to remain in the land of Israel and not go abroad. A disciple of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai went abroad and returned wealthy. I think we all encounter this even today, this reality. One goes abroad, returns wealthy, and he's the envy of everyone else. And the students saw him and were jealous and wished also to go abroad. Rabbi Shimon saw this and took them to a valley near Miron. You all know where Miron is, up north. He prayed, Rabbi Shimon, "O valley, fill up with golden dinars." And indeed, golden dinars poured forth. He said to them, to those students who wanted to go and enrich themselves abroad, he said to them, "If it is gold you desire, behold, here is your gold. Take it, but be aware that anyone who takes it now, it is his reward in the world to come that he takes." This is a beautiful story. There is a reward for living in the land of Israel, but it is the ultimate reward. It's not the immediate reward, but the reward that one receives in the world to come. But this is enhanced by other statements. Whoever leaves the land in a time of peace and goes abroad, it is as if he worships idols. And now we get to very extreme statements. If you go abroad, this is lack of faith in God. It's as if you became a pagan. And I like the stress here, if you go abroad in a time of peace. Now remember, after the Bar Kokhba War, and particularly in the second half of the 2nd century, towards the latter part of that century, under the Severan dynasty, during the days of Judah, the patriarch, Yehuda HaNasi, which was considered by some of the rabbis to be a time of peace, if you go abroad, it is as if you worship an idol. For it is written, "I will plant them in this land in faithfulness." Those who remain in the land are people of faith with all my heart and all my soul. And it had practical problems as well. Remaining in the land of Israel, coming to the land of Israel. And here again, an early source. Maybe we'll just read part of this. The husband, what happens when a couple can't decide, do they move to Israel or not move to Israel? Certainly an event that I assume takes place in the diaspora today, literally every day. He, the husband, desires to come to Eretz Israel. She, his wife, does not wish to come. She is coerced to come. Now, you might suspect that this is because he's the husband and she better listen to him. No. If she wishes to come and he does not, he is coerced to come. So it's not the husband or the wife that has the final say, it's the land of Israel. And if one of the couple wishes to come to the land of Israel, the other, right, the spouse is required to follow to the land as well. What is striking, and I'm going to skip part of this, if you go down, even the Babylonian Talmud has this version. There's another version here. There are 2 versions. But if you look at the bottom line here, Babylonian Talmud Ketubot 10b, if she wishes to go up to the land and he refuses, he is coerced to go up. And if he refuses, he must divorce her and pay her ketubah. He loses his wife, he loses the value of the marriage contract of the ketubah, because he refuses to go up to the land. So the land now becomes a factor, and as I said, nowhere do we encounter this throughout the Second Temple period. And even more interesting is, there was a Jewish state, right? Under the Hasmoneans, one could have thought that the Jewish state requires, at least for that period of time, for Jews to move to the land, and that's not the case. It's only as we get to the latter part of the 2nd century that we begin to encounter these statements. And then these statements are enhanced by a very extreme attitude against anyone who nevertheless wants to leave the land. And the story here, which appears in the Palestinian Talmud in the Yerushalmi, is, I think, a striking one. A certain priest, a Kohen, approached Rabbi Hanina Bar Chama, who is a rabbi probably in the city of Sepphoris at this time, but one interesting fact has to be mentioned. He is a ole from Babylonia. And he takes the most extreme pro-Zionist aspect, right? One almost expects that the ole, the person who actually left the diaspora, is now the real zealot for a pro-Judean attitude. And so a priest approaches Rabbi Hanina Bar Chama with the following question. My brother has passed away, leaving a childless widow. And you know, of course, if there's a childless widow, the brother is either required to marry that woman, yibum, levirate marriage, or to remove her bonds, right, chalitza, to that brother, to her brother-in-law. In other words, to free her. This is a cardinal mitzvah. You've either got to marry this childless widow or free her from any bonds that she has to you to let her get on with life, because otherwise she remains without a husband for the rest of her life. And so here this fellow approaches the rabbi. My brother left a childless widow. Is it possible to leave the land for Tyre? Apparently this widow finds herself b'chutz la'aretz, outside the land, in Tyre in the Lebanon. Can I go there to perform a mitzvah, either of levirate marriage, yibum, or chalitza, releasing her from her bond to me, which of course is what is described in Deuteronomy. In other words, here's a fellow who wants to leave Galilee for Tyre. It's a matter of a few hours, no more than that. I can go to Tyre, just north of the border, perform levirate marriage, yibum, and come back with her, or at least free her to get on with life. But this requires leaving the land of Israel. Whereupon the rabbi responded. He replied, your brother left the land, blessed is God that killed him. Do you wish to follow in his steps? Some say he replied, your brother abandoned his mother's bosom, chekimo, embraced a foreign bosom. Blessed is God that killed him. You remember what we saw the Jews of Alexandria claiming that it is their motherland, Jerusalem, but the other lands are also their father's land or their inheritance. And now we have this extremely, right, what should I say, a critical attitude towards anyone even contemplating leaving the land. Blessed is God who killed your brother for leaving the land. Do you want to follow in his footsteps? And we get a sense that this has now become an issue. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, again 3rd century, said, I will walk before the Lord in the land of the living. Etalech be'artzot ha'chayim. Lefnei Hashem be'artzot ha'chayim. Where is the land of the living? Are not the lands of the living Tyre? Here again we find Tyre and its environs, Caesarea and its environs. For there everything is cheap. There is abundance. Is Israel really the land of the living? Now, is the land of Israel really the land of the living? Do not men die in it? In other words, what is this reference to the land of Israel as being the land of the living, artzot ha'chayim? And the rabbi, Shimon ben Lakish, in the name of Bar Kapara, said, the psalmist means a land whose dead will come to life first in the days of the Messiah. And this is interesting. You can't just make, right, demands upon Jews of the diaspora. Come now, get up, leave your supposed fatherland in the diaspora and come back to the land of Israel. You can't make that claim, that demand, without offering something. The carrot has to come along with the stick, as it were. And what is the carrot here? It is a land whose dead will come to life first in the days of the Messiah. On what basis? Who gives breath to the people upon it. And this, of course, is the source for the belief that those who are buried in the land of Israel will be the first to rise up with the coming of the Messiah. And this is striking. This is probably one of the two bases for the development of the custom of sending the dead for burial from the diaspora to the land of Israel. And again, striking, this is a custom that has no reference to it throughout the Second Temple period. Nowhere does it appear. And even when we do find, archaeologists have discovered some inscriptions of Jews from the diaspora in the area of Jerusalem and elsewhere, from the Second Temple period, it could very well be that these were people who came on a pilgrimage to the land of Israel and to Jerusalem, died here and were buried here, and even in certain cases may have moved, as we saw in the days of Herod. There were certainly Jews who did move at times to Jerusalem, but during the Second Temple period, there is no ideology. There's no theology to the issue of having people sent for burial to the land of Israel. And this idea begins to appear only when we get to the late second and I would say actually third century of the Common Era. So now, not just calls for a return to Zion, but theological reasons for a return to Zion. This, as we will see in a minute, was one of two, what shall I say, draws, right, or attractions for wanting to be buried in the land of Israel. The other will be, as we'll see in a moment, those who are buried in the land of Israel will have their sins atoned for, right? V'chiper admato amo. The land will make expiation for the people. And we'll see that in a few minutes. But this issue, having the dead sent for burial to the land of Israel, although it became a hallowed custom, and by the way, I want to stress, if you read the story of Jacob and Joseph in the book of Genesis, it doesn't say, bury me in the land because that's where one has to be buried. What it says is, V'shachavtiim avotai, I will lie with my forefathers, ukvartani b'kvuratam, I want to be buried in the family plot. It's not an issue of wanting to be buried in the land of Israel that the Bible stresses, but rather wanting to be buried with one's family. But here we already have this idea of rising up with the days of the Messiah. Whereupon the Talmud asks an interesting question. What about those people who couldn't be reburied in the land of Israel? Will they not rise up in the days of the Messiah? And so the Talmud asks, if so, our sages in the Golah have lost out. They won't rise up. They remain buried abroad. Rabbi Simai said, the Holy One, blessed be He, will bore through the earth before them, and they will roll through like wineskins. And when they arrive in Eretz Yisrael, their souls will return to them. Fantastic. In other words, tunnels will be created from abroad to the land of Israel, and the righteous who were buried abroad will have their bodies roll through these tunnels until they arrive in the land of Israel, and then their soul, they will rise up again with the coming of the Messiah. You have the parallel here in Babylonian Talmud Ketubot. Rabbi Eli said, they will be revived by rolling, gilgul, right? Their bones will roll, have rolling bones. Rabbi Abba Salah the Great demurred, will not the rolling be painful to the righteous? Abaye said, tunnels will be made. It's not just sort of rolling through the earth, but full-fledged tunnels will be created. And there's an interesting play on words here. Gilgul ba-mechilot, the rolling within tunnels, but the word mechila, of course, doesn't mean only tunnel. It also means, of course, the forgiving of sins. So the gilgul, this rolling, will create atonement as well through tunnels. So tunnels are mechilot, and mechilot are atonement, which will be made for them in the ground. And as you know, there develops a custom of bringing the dead for burial. We have numerous examples. The most famous example, of course, being the necropolis of Beit Sha'arim. Now, not all the people buried in Beit Sha'arim were brought from abroad, right? In fact, even if the inscriptions are in Greek, it could be that people from cities like Caesarea on the coast or other Greek-speaking centers had people reburied in Beit Sha'arim. But here you have one from abroad, Daniel, the son of Ada from Tyre. And this is so common. Jews abroad very often knew one word or two words, and one of them, of course, was shalom. Sometimes it was peace for Israel, shalom al Yisrael. Their vocabulary in Hebrew sometimes was limited to less than 10 words. Here we have another example from Beit Sha'arim, the tomb of Idesios, head of the council of elders from Antioch, meaning from Syria. So this wish to be buried or reinterred, as it were, in the land of Israel, takes on steam as we get into the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries. And then we read again a fantastic story. This didn't go over quietly. The Jews abroad think they can have the best of both worlds. They can live abroad and then get themselves buried in the land of Israel, thereby rising up with the Messiah. Rabbi Bar Korai and Rabbi Elazar were sitting and studying Torah in the Ilasis, which means the glass factory of Tiberias. In fact, I even think I know where this is on the outskirts of Tiberias. There's another version here that says the gates of Tiberias. They were sitting and studying Torah when they saw coffins arriving from abroad, based on the custom that we just saw. But now listen to what the Judean rabbi has to say about this custom. Said Rabbi Bar Korai to Rabbi Elazar, regarding these, meaning these coffins or these people having their bodies interred and sent to Israel for burial, regarding these, I apply the verse, in your lifetime, Jeremiah says, you made my position abhorrent. Nachlati samtem toeva. You had no use for my possession, meaning my land, during your lifetime. And in your death, you came and defiled my land. Dead bodies create defilement, right? They're impure. They create impurity. This is a tremendously extreme statement, scoffing at this custom. You had no need for the land of Israel in your lifetime. We don't need dead bodies here, the rabbi seems to be saying. If you had no need for us now, we have no need for you now either. His colleague, however, Elazar, tried to assuage, tried to quiet him down. Not so. When they come to the land of Israel, they place upon them a lump of earth, thus atoning for their sins. In other words, when a lump of earth is placed in the coffin, this atones for their sins. On what basis is this assertion made? The land makes expiation for his people. V'chiper admato amo. The land, the physical land, will make expiation. So yes, there is an advantage to being buried in the land of Israel. Your sins will be atoned for. But this debate here, this clash of opinions tells you that not everybody accepted this approach, that Jews of the diaspora can correct their status by having their bodies sent here. And then, of course, and we're about to end this chapter now, there were those Jews abroad who actually claimed there's no need to move now to the land of Israel, and tried to prevent their students, their disciples, from getting up and leaving and going to the Holy Land. Rabbi Zera, a young student in Babylonia in the 3rd century, was avoiding his Rosh Yeshiva, right, Rav Yehuda, who was the head of the center in Pumbedita in Babylonia. Why did Rabbi Zera avoid his mentor? For he, Zera, wished to go up to the land of Israel. And Rav Judah said, all who go up from Babylonia to the land of Israel transgress a positive commandment. It is forbidden to go up to the land of Israel. For it says, now this is strange, a positive commandment, you would expect a scripture from the Torah, not from the prophets. For it says, again Jeremiah, they shall be carried to Babylon and there they shall remain until I remember them, said the Lord. The Talmud, I'll make this long source brief, the Talmud says that scripture has nothing to do with the people of Israel. It relates to the vessels of the tabernacle or of the temple, the vessels of ministry. Well, then Rav Yehuda says, I have another scripture. or he would say if he were required to find another scripture, and that is the scripture from Song of Songs. I charge you, O ye daughters of Jerusalem, that ye stir not up nor awake my love. In other words, don't become too activist, and certainly too Zionist activist, as it were, till it please, right? In other words, Rav Yehuda says, don't take this active stance, this pro-Judean stance by moving to the land of Israel. Wait it out until God makes this manifestly a time for restoration. What would Rabbi Zera say? Because he nevertheless wants to go to the land. He would reply, this scripture, not to go up, refers to prohibition of going up as a wall, en masse, kechoma. In other words, Rabbi Zera says, individuals, private persons can go up to the land of Israel. What the text seems to be suggesting is we haven't reached the stage of a mass return to Zion. That should wait until the proper moment. And so you have a sense now that calls are now emanating from the land of Israel to the diaspora, and certainly to the Babylonian diaspora, stressing, this is really unacceptable, this remaining abroad, in this case in Babylonia. The rabbis of Babylonia have to come up with a response. And the response is, yes, maybe we shouldn't push it. The scripture in Jeremiah seems to suggest to wait it out, or maybe Song of Songs says to wait it out. The issue becomes an issue. So, by the way, I have to tell you that this source speaks to me personally. When I was a young boy about to finish elementary school in yeshiva, my rabbi, and I was almost 14 years old, about to move to Israel. And I remember my rabbi, the equivalent of Rav Yehuda, telling me, Shaya, you really should think twice about moving to Israel. People can go astray in Israel. That was his phrase, Efshar lehitkalkel ba'aretz, right? And so I sort of commiserate with Rabbi Zera, his rabbi too, suggesting he not move to the land of Israel. But there were Jews who remained in Babylonia. This would become the second and ultimately the most important rabbinic center. And the Talmud explains why Babylonia was chosen. Why were Israel exiled to Babylonia more than all other lands? Because the house of Abraham, our patriarch, is from there. To what might this be likened? To a woman who has misbehaved towards her husband. To where does he send her? To her father's home. So we in Babylonia basically reside in our father's home. In other words, if you remember those statements of Jews in Alexandria, they inherited a land from their forefathers. Now we're told that the ultimate fatherland is Babylonia, because that's where the father of the nation, Abraham, came from before moving, as it were, to the land of Israel. This is an issue. And it remains an issue throughout the rabbinic period. Is it a requirement to move to Israel? Is it just a luxury for those who can afford to move or have their bones sent to Israel? The issue of living in the diaspora that we all recognize today, and the dilemma encountering Jews who have to decide, should they move to Israel, should they not move to Israel? This is a long-established dilemma. This is something that appears in the aftermath of the destruction, and particularly in the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba uprising, in a strange way, to the extent that Jews were decimated during the Bar Kokhba uprising, that the name of the land was changed from Judea to Palestine, as it were. It's in that context that we find a reverse phenomena of Jews saying, maybe it's time to reestablish our presence in the land of Israel. Certainly those calls to Zion, now coming out of rabbinic statements from the land of Israel, those calls seem to suggest that maybe we have to correct the reality that has existed for so many hundreds of years. So this is yet another tale of the diaspora to go along with those other tales. What I've tried to do in these last 4 weeks is open up a window to, again, the dilemma that a Jew encountered living abroad, living in an alien environment and sometimes a hostile environment, and knowing that there is a land of Israel and knowing that there's a Jewish center already existing in the land of Israel, and the ultimate decision of to move or not to move has to be made, and it was probably a very difficult decision for every family who lived during these centuries. Let us stop here. Okay.
First of all, thank you very much, Professor Gafni. I'm sure the audience has enjoyed the series with you. I'm reminding you that we actually began this series because we were marking the month of Adar and the book of Megillat Esther and trying to discuss diaspora during the times of the story of Purim. If anyone has questions, it's time for the time to type them in the chat. I'll look through to see what question Chava Bracha wrote. She said that the reason to return that was presented reminds of the reason of Pharaoh writing to Sinuet.
I'm not sure I know those references here. Oh.
Okay. Okay. Let's see. Just a moment. There's a lot of other things in the chat. I'm trying. Okay. Vivian wanted to mark if what the similarity is to American Jewry today, if you want to touch on that subject.
A very touchy subject. And it's not only America, of course. It's wherever Jews reside. And we've seen, even in this past generation, different attitudes. We all remember 20, 30, 40 years ago, the ultimate negative attitude to those people who leave the land of Israel, a very well-known phrase used by the late Prime Minister Rabin, referring to those who abandon ship, as it were. And today the attitude has changed. Today there's a certain willingness to accept the legitimacy of diaspora functioning alongside the land of Israel. And I think it's very similar to what we encountered in the Second Temple period. Jews in Israel in the Second Temple period knew there was an advantage to having a widespread Jewish presence throughout the Roman Empire and in the East. It served as a political, as providing political leverage. The Romans were sometimes afraid to take action against Jews because they knew that they might have an international Jewish uprising on their hands. But there were positive reasons for the diaspora as well, one of them being the financial support that they received from Jews of the diaspora through the shkalim that were sent again in the month of Adar to the land of Israel. And we know that we're talking about very significant amounts of money. Cicero gives us sums of money that were sent to the temple in Jerusalem from Jews abroad, even just from Asia Minor alone. So there are similarities. And I think in many ways, our reality today is somewhat similar to the situation of the Second Temple period and not to the post-Temple period. You hear fewer calls for aliya even today, right, than you used to hear, let's say, 20, 30 years ago from leaders of the Jewish community in the land of Israel.
Good. Well, so here's a different question. Simon is asking if we can attribute any specific reasons for the unwillingness of Rabbi Akiva to make more bold pronouncements in favor of moving to Israel.
It's an excellent question for which I don't really have a definitive answer. And actually, the question can be enhanced because Akiva travels abroad. We have a number of stories where we find Rabbi Akiva in different Jewish communities abroad. Now, I'd love to believe that in each of those communities he had a drasha on Shabbat when he got up in the synagogue and said, you know, all of you ought to move to Israel within the next month or so. No, I think what happened is, again, these are ideologies that develop over time. And Rabbi Akiva apparently did not receive from his mentors this very defined approach saying one must live only in the land of Israel, because it's not just Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is a transmitter of earlier traditions, and that claim does not appear as I say, in the teaching of Yochanan ben Zakkai, in the teaching of his very own mentors, Rabbis Eliezer, Rabbi Yehoshua, his colleague Rabbi Tarfon, his colleague Rabbi Ishmael, none of them make statements requiring the movement of Jews from abroad to the land of Israel. So there's no reason to expect that Rabbi Akiva would do this. I think that the Bar Kokhba War was a tremendous shift in the mentality. It was a shock, as it were, for Jews living in the land of Israel, who suddenly asked themselves, what's going to happen now to the land? We cannot achieve political independence, but maybe demographic realities will have an impact. In other words, whereas the Romans are here to stay, might Jews not also be here to stay, right? By preventing yirida, by preventing emigration from the land and encouraging aliya to the land. In other words, it could be the ultimate antidote to the defeat of Bar Kokhba. The only way we can win this battle, supposedly with Rome, is not on the military battlefield, but in the demographic battlefield, by simply having Jews living here. And it could be that that's what happens after Bar Kokhba, but of course by then Rabbi Akiva is no longer alive.
Right. So one last question from Ariel. Do we have any record of correspondence between Israel and the diaspora during any of the 3 uprisings?
It's a good question. First of all, not really correspondence. In other words, there are references in literature to the fact that Jews of the diaspora might have been expected to come to the land of Israel, right? But somehow that never really came to any fruition. But not really reference. We have very few documents, as it were. What we have are historiography. We have Josephus describing the wars, right? Or the war, right? We have Cassius Dio describing the Bar Kokhba uprising. But none of them really attest to the fact that a Jew living in the land of Israel writes to someone abroad saying, you know, we need you here and we need you immediately. No, unfortunately, that type of correspondence is not forthcoming.